Wolfdog waited 5 years. What he does next will break your heart. The evening air smelled of fresh grass and damp soil as Margaret Carter stepped out of the small wooden house, carrying a tin bowl filled with food. The sun had begun its slow descent beyond the rolling hills, casting an amber glow over the quiet village of Ridgewood. Birds chirped softly in the distance, but near the old farmhouse there was only silence, except for the steady sound of paws shifting on the gravel. Near the wooden fence that enclosed the yard, Coda, a large wolf dog with a thick coat of gray and black fur, sat perfectly still. His golden eyes were fixed on the dirt road beyond the gate, the same road his master, Elias Carter, had walked down 5 years ago. Margaret sighed. "Coda," she called gently, shaking the tin bowl. "Come eat." Coda didn't move. He never moved at this time of day. This was the hour Elias used to return from his work in the fields, and Coda had never let go of the habit of waiting. He had waited every single day since Elias left for war. Margaret's heart ached as she walked toward him, setting the food down beside his paws. She ran her fingers through his thick fur, feeling the slight tension in his muscles. "You miss him, don't you?" she whispered. Coda's ears twitched, but his gaze remained locked on the road. Margaret wished she could say something to comfort him. She wished she could comfort herself. For 5 years, she had held on to hope, just like Coda. Letters had come at first, long, reassuring letters from Elias telling her that he was safe, that he would return soon. Then the letters stopped. No explanation, no news, just silence. And silence, Margaret had learned, was the cruelest thing. Ridgewood was a small village where news traveled quickly and rumors spread even faster. At first, people spoke kindly about Elias. "He'll be back, just you wait." But as the months turned into years, their words grew colder. At the market, she often overheard them talking. "No one comes back after this long. He's gone, Margaret. Best to accept it." She never responded to them. She didn't have to. Coda spoke for her. Every day, the wolf dog's silent vigil at the gate was a message to the entire village. Elias would return. He had to. But the truth was, doubt had begun creeping into Margaret's heart. Late at night, when the world was quiet, she let herself wonder, what if they're right? What if I've been waiting for nothing? And yet, every morning she would rise with renewed determination, and every evening she would sit beside Coda, watching the road with him, waiting, because letting go felt impossible. That night, a storm rolled in. Margaret stood at the front door, watching as dark clouds gathered over the hills. A strong wind rattled the windows, and in the distance, thunder rumbled like the growl of an angry beast. "Coda," she called, "come inside before the rain starts." But Coda didn't move. Margaret stepped forward, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Then something strange happened. Coda's ears shot up, his body tensed, his head turned slightly, his nose twitching as if catching a scent in the wind. Then, for the first time in years, he let out a low, deep whine. Margaret's breath caught. "What is it?" Coda stood up suddenly, his golden eyes locked on the darkness beyond the gate. His tail stiffened, and his fur bristled as if something unseen had sent a shiver down his spine. Then he did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He howled, a long, sorrowful sound that echoed through the village, breaking the quiet of the night. The hairs on Margaret's arms rose. Coda never howled, not since Elias left. Margaret turned toward the road, staring into the shadows. There was nothing there, just the wind sweeping through the fields and the sound of approaching rain. But Coda sensed something, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt something deep in her chest. Not fear, not grief, something else. Hope.
The storm arrived in full force that night. Thunder cracked overhead as rain lashed against the windows, drumming an uneasy rhythm that matched the pounding in Margaret's chest. The fire in the hearth flickered wildly, casting long, shivering shadows across the wooden walls. She sat by the window, barely blinking, watching Coda. He hadn't moved from the gate. The rain had drenched his thick fur, but he remained still, his ears pointed forward, his golden eyes locked onto something beyond the darkness. Occasionally, he let out a low whine, pacing in small circles before returning to his original spot. Margaret had seen Coda restless before, but never like this. It was as if the storm itself had whispered something to him, a secret only he could hear. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Margaret grabbed her shawl and pushed open the door. The wind howled instantly, tearing at her clothes and sending shivers down her spine. "Coda!" she called over the storm. "Come inside!" The wolfdog snapped his head toward her, his soaked fur clinging to his frame. But he didn't move. Instead, he let out a sharp, desperate bark, not one of warning, but urgency. His tail was stiff, his paws shifting restlessly against the wet ground. Margaret had spent years learning to understand Coda's unspoken language. And this was different. A deep, gut-wrenching sense of knowing. Margaret followed his gaze toward the dirt path beyond the gate, but all she saw was darkness and rain. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Then, just as lightning split the sky, her breath caught in her throat. For the briefest moment, just beyond the trees, she swore she saw a figure. A shadowed shape, too still to be the wind, too far to recognize. She blinked, her heart pounding. But when the next flash of lightning came, it was gone. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose slowly, its golden rays filtering through the trees, making the fields glisten with fresh rain. But Margaret's unease had not left her. She stepped outside, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The ground was soft with mud, and puddles reflected the pale sky. Coda stood near the fence, his fur still damp but his body tense, as if waiting for something else. Margaret moved toward him, running her fingers through his thick coat. "What did you see last night?" she murmured, as if expecting an answer. Coda suddenly tensed. Then, before Margaret could react, he sniffed the ground and began digging. Dirt and grass flew into the air as his powerful paws tore at the softened earth. Margaret stepped back, watching in shock. He had never done this before, never in this spot. Her pulse quickened. Why now? Then, with a sharp snort, Coda paused. His nose dipped toward the ground, his breath coming in short puffs. Margaret cautiously knelt beside him and brushed the dirt aside. Her fingers met something cold, something metal, a dog tag. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. The surface was smeared with dirt, the edges worn from time. She ran her thumb over the name etched into the steel, her breath catching in her throat. Elias Carter. Margaret's vision blurred. How? She had cleaned this yard 100 times. How had this been buried here, right at the gate? And why had Coda found it now? Her heart pounded. Elias had taken this tag with him when he left for war. She remembered the way he had slipped it over his head the day he said goodbye. So how had it ended up here? She turned to Coda, gripping the tag tightly. "What are you trying to tell me?" The wolfdog let out a quiet whine, his golden eyes locked onto hers. It wasn't just chance. It was a message. The tavern's news. That afternoon, Margaret made her way to the village market, her fingers still curled around the dog tag in her pocket. She needed answers. The market was lively, vendors calling out their prices, children darting between carts, and villagers exchanging gossip over baskets of fresh bread. Margaret barely noticed any of it. Her feet carried her toward the tavern, where news from the outside world always arrived first. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, warmth greeted her, along with hushed voices. A group of men sat near the bar, speaking in low tones. Margaret froze when she heard one of them say, "More soldiers have returned, but not all of them." Her chest tightened. She stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Did you say soldiers?" she asked, her voice quieter than she had intended. One of the men turned toward her, Jacob, the blacksmith's apprentice. He looked at her with hesitation, then sighed. "A messenger arrived last night, said some of the soldiers are finally coming home." Margaret's stomach twisted. "And Elias? Did they say anything about Elias Carter?" Jacob's face fell. He glanced toward the others, then back at her. They didn't mention him. The words sank into her like stones. Margaret swallowed, her fingers clenching the fabric of her dress. Of course, they hadn't. She had waited 5 years for his name to be spoken, and yet every time it was missing from the list of the living. She should have been used to it by now, but this time felt different. This time, she had the dog tag, a sign from him, and last night Coda had seen something. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Where are the returning soldiers?" Jacob hesitated. "They'll be passing through the next town in 2 days. But Margaret, don't get your hopes up. Some of them." He stopped, shaking his head. Not all of them are the same men who left. She knew what he meant. War changed people, and some never came back at all. But Margaret didn't care, because she wasn't just waiting anymore. She was going to find out the truth. She stepped away from the tavern, her heart pounding, Coda's presence suddenly heavy at her side. He had led her to the dog tag, and now she was certain something was coming. 2 days later, Margaret stood at the crossroads, gripping the straps of her satchel as she waited. The dirt path stretched ahead, vanishing into the rolling hills beyond. Somewhere along that road, the returning soldiers would be making their way through the next village. She had barely slept the night before. Her mind was a battlefield of thoughts, hope clashing against fear. What if Elias was there? What if he wasn't? A sharp bark snapped her from her thoughts. Coda stood beside her, his golden eyes locked on the path ahead. His body was tense, his ears flicking at the faintest rustle in the wind. He could sense something coming even before she could hear it. Then, in the distance, hoofbeats. Margaret's heart jumped in her chest. She strained her eyes, her breath catching as figures began to emerge over the hill. Soldiers. They were weary, battle-worn, their uniforms tattered, their boots coated in dust from the long march home. Some leaned on one another for support, others walked with empty eyes, haunted by what they had seen. Margaret's throat tightened. She searched desperately, her gaze scanning every face, her heart hammering with every step they took closer. Then, her stomach sank. Elias wasn't there. The relief of the villagers around her was deafening, loved ones crying, embracing, calling names in disbelief and joy. But Margaret stood frozen, the weight of 5 years pressing down on her shoulders. She felt Coda lean against her leg, his presence grounding her, but it wasn't enough to stop the ache in her chest. Then a familiar voice broke through the noise. "Margaret?" She turned sharply to see Sergeant Harwood. His face was thinner than she remembered, his brown eyes dulled by exhaustion. His uniform hung loosely on his frame, and a deep scar cut across his temple. But it was him. Margaret took a shaky step forward. "Sergeant, you know something, don't you?" Harwood hesitated. The hesitation made her stomach turn. He exhaled slowly. "I don't have good news." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. "Tell me," she whispered. Harwood ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "The last time I saw Elias, he saved us." Margaret blinked. "What?" "We were under heavy fire." His voice wavered slightly. "He told us to retreat, said he'd cover us. We didn't want to leave, but we had no choice." Margaret clenched her fists. "And then?" Harwood's silence stretched for too long. Finally, he shook his head. "We never saw him again." The words shattered her. For a long moment, Margaret couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world around her blurred, as if it were pulling away from her, fading into nothing. Coda let out a low whine, pressing against her leg. Margaret swallowed, trying to steady herself. She forced herself to speak, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. "But you don't know for sure." Harwood hesitated again. "That's what I thought," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. She lifted her chin, a spark of defiance flickering in her chest. "If there's no proof, then he's still out there." Harwood sighed. "Margaret, no." Her eyes burned. "I refuse to believe it." Coda suddenly let out a deep growl, his ears standing straight. His gaze was locked onto the road leading out of the village, the one leading toward the mountains. Margaret followed his gaze, her heartbeat picking up. Something stirred in her gut, a feeling she couldn't explain. She turned back to Harwood. "Where exactly did you last see Elias?" Harwood frowned. "Why?" Margaret tightened her grip on her satchel. "Because I'm going to find him." The villagers thought she had lost her mind. "You can't go looking for a ghost, Margaret. The war ended months ago. There's nothing left out there but ruins." She ignored them all. She packed only what she needed: food, a canteen of water, a lantern, and a pocket knife. Elias had once given her before he left, and as Coda trotted beside her, unwavering, she knew she wasn't going alone. Harwood had told her where the last battle had taken place, near the mountain pass beyond the river. If Elias had survived, if he had somehow escaped, he would have been left with nowhere to go but the wild. Margaret walked through the dense woods, each step filled with equal parts fear and determination. The journey was rough. Muddy trails, thick undergrowth, the distant sound of wolves howling in the night. But Coda moved with purpose, his nose to the ground, his body tense with focus. It was as if he knew exactly where he was going. Margaret had always trusted Coda's instincts, but this time it was different. This time she was following him. Then, on the third day, she saw it. Something buried beneath the roots of a tree. Margaret dropped to her knees, brushing away the leaves, her breath catching when she uncovered a leather satchel. It was old, its straps torn and the leather weathered from time. Her hands trembled as she unbuckled it. Inside, she found a journal. And when she flipped open the first page, she saw the name Elias Carter scrawled in his unmistakable handwriting. Margaret's chest tightened. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, her breath hitching at the words inside. If I don't make it out of this, I pray Coda finds his way home. He always knows the way. Tears blurred her vision. Elias was alive when he wrote this. And Coda had led her straight to it. Margaret swallowed hard, lifting her gaze. She looked at Coda, who stood rigid, ears alert, golden eyes locked on something ahead. She followed his gaze toward the mountain path beyond the trees. Margaret rose to her feet. She gripped the journal tightly, her heartbeat pounding with a single undeniable truth. She was close. She was going to find him. The forest grew thicker and darker as Margaret followed Coda through the underbrush. The towering trees blocked most of the sunlight, casting long shadows across the damp ground. The further they traveled, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the sound of their footsteps. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched Elias's journal, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had found his words, his thoughts, proof that he had been here. But where was he now? Coda moved with urgency, his nose close to the ground, sniffing the path ahead. His tail was stiff, his body tense. He was following a scent, one that he recognized. Margaret swallowed, pushing forward through the thick brush. She didn't know what she would find at the end of this road, but she knew, deep in her bones, that Elias was close. After hours of walking, the forest suddenly thinned out. Margaret nearly stumbled as she stepped into a clearing and froze. At the center of the clearing stood an old wooden cabin, half hidden by overgrown vines and moss. The roof sagged and the windows were dark, empty. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. But the door? It was slightly ajar. Margaret's breath caught. She turned to Coda, who stood completely still, his ears perked forward. He let out a low, deep growl, not in warning, but in recognition. Margaret's stomach twisted. She took a shaky step forward, her boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she reached the door. Slowly, she pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty cabin. Inside, it was dim and cold. The smell of damp wood and old ashes filled the air. A small fireplace sat in the corner, long extinguished. A wooden table covered in dust stood in the center of the room. And then, Margaret gasped. In the farthest corner of the room, a figure sat slumped against the wall. His face was hidden behind a mess of tangled hair and a thick beard. His clothes were torn and caked in dried mud. His hands, resting weakly on his lap, were covered in scars. He looked like a ghost of a man, but Margaret knew him. Even after 5 years, she would know him anywhere. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The figure stirred. A ragged breath escaped him as he slowly lifted his head. Margaret's chest tightened painfully. It was him, Elias Carter. But his eyes, they were hollow, empty, as if the man he once was had been lost in the war. Elias blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused. Margaret took a hesitant step forward. "Elias, it's me. It's Margaret." His brows furrowed, as if he were trying to remember her name. Then, Coda let out a sharp bark. The sound snapped through the air like lightning, echoing off the cabin walls. And something changed. Elias's body went rigid, his breathing hitched. His tired, dull eyes shifted toward the Wolfdog. Coda stepped forward, his tail high, his eyes locked on Elias. He whined, not out of fear, but out of longing. Then, a sob escaped Elias's throat. "Coda?" His voice was hoarse, cracked with disbelief. Coda lunged forward, pressing his massive body against Elias, burying his face into his chest. Elias let out a shaky, broken laugh as his hands gripped Coda's fur. Margaret watched as tears streaked down his dirt-covered face. She felt her own vision blur. Elias was alive. He was here. And after all these years, Coda had finally brought them back together. Margaret knelt beside them, her voice shaking. "Elias, we thought you were dead?" Elias rasped, still holding Coda tightly. "I almost was." Margaret felt a cold dread settle over her. "What happened?" Elias took a shaky breath, his fingers still gripping Coda's fur as if afraid he would disappear. "When I stayed behind that night, I was wounded, badly." His voice was quiet, rough, like someone who had spent too many years speaking only to himself. "I crawled away from the battlefield. I thought I would die in the mud, but I kept moving. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to keep going." Margaret's chest ached. She had imagined so many possibilities, but not this. Elias swallowed hard. "I don't remember how long I wandered, days, maybe weeks. I was half dead when I found this place." He gestured weakly to the cabin. "I don't even know who built it, but it became home." Margaret stared at him. 5 years. For 5 years he had been alone. "Why didn't you try to come back?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Elias let out a bitter laugh. "I did, the first year. I tried, but I was weak. I kept collapsing, I got lost, and the winter, it nearly killed me. By the time I recovered, I was different." Margaret understood what he didn't say. He didn't just lose his way. He lost himself. Elias looked at her then, his gaze heavy. "How did you find me?" Margaret's throat tightened. It wasn't me. She turned to Coda, who still sat pressed against Elias, his tail wagging slightly. "It was him," she whispered. "He never stopped waiting for you, and when I was ready to give up, he led me here." Elias looked at Coda with something deep, unspoken, powerful. Then, very slowly, he nodded. He always knew the way home. Margaret blinked back tears. "Come back with us, Elias, please." Elias hesitated. His gaze drifted around the small, broken-down cabin, the prison he had built for himself. Then, finally, he nodded. Margaret let out a shaky, relieved breath. It was time. Time to go home. The journey home was harder than Margaret expected. Elias was weak. His body had endured years of hardship, malnutrition, injuries, and the cold solitude of the wilderness. He could barely stand without leaning on her or gripping Coda's thick fur for support. The first night, they didn't get far. Margaret set up camp near a shallow creek, spreading out a blanket while Coda kept watch. She handed Elias a small piece of bread and dried meat, but he only stared at it. "You need to eat," she said softly. Elias turned the food over in his hands, his fingers tracing the rough edges. Then, very slowly, he took a bite. Margaret pretended not to notice the tears in his eyes. As they traveled, Elias spoke in small pieces. He told her how he had tried to return to Ridgewood that first year, how snowstorms had trapped him, forcing him to survive off whatever he could find. How he had dreamt of home, but as time passed, the dream felt less real. "I thought I was forgotten," he admitted one evening as they walked beneath a sky full of stars. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. "You weren't." Coda never stopped waiting. Elias looked down at Coda, who padded faithfully at his side. His scarred fingers ran through the wolfdog's fur, and his lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. "He saved me," Elias whispered. Margaret didn't ask if he meant now or before. She already knew the answer. Margaret's breath hitched when she saw the familiar rooftops in the distance. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the church bell tolled softly, marking the hour. Home. Elias stopped beside her, gripping a nearby tree for balance. His breathing was heavy. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. Margaret turned to him, her heart aching. "You don't have to do it alone." Coda pressed against his side, offering the same silent comfort he had given for 5 long years. Elias exhaled shakily, then took the first step forward. When they entered Ridgewood, the first person to see them was Jacob, the blacksmith's apprentice. He dropped the stack of firewood he had been carrying. For a long moment, he just stared. Then, without a word, he ran toward the tavern. Margaret knew what would happen next. Word would spread like wildfire. The people of Ridgewood had already buried Elias in their hearts. Now he had returned. As they walked through the village, doors swung open. People stepped onto the streets, their eyes wide in shock, disbelief. An old woman whispered, "It can't be." A man muttered, "I thought he was dead." Margaret felt Elias stiffen beside her. She knew this was overwhelming, but then a small voice pierced the silence. "Captain Carter?" Elias turned his head. A little boy, no older than 7, stood at the edge of the street. He clutched his mother's hand, his eyes filled with pure wonder. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Then, one by one, the villagers began to step forward. They weren't just seeing a soldier return, they were seeing a man who had survived. And slowly, the whispers turned into cheers. Margaret led Elias back to the old farmhouse. Coda ran ahead, barking joyfully as they reached the familiar wooden fence. Elias stopped at the gate. Margaret saw the emotion flicker across his face as he looked at the place he had once called home. "I never thought I'd see it again," he admitted. Margaret swallowed back her own emotions. "Come inside." Elias hesitated, then stepped through the gate. As soon as he did, Coda leapt onto the porch, letting out a deep, victorious howl. It was the sound of homecoming. The weeks that followed were not easy. Elias still suffered from nightmares. Some nights, Margaret would hear him wake up gasping for breath, trapped in memories of the battlefield. But every night, Coda was there. The Wolfdog would press his body against Elias, grounding him, bringing him back to the present. During the days, Elias started rebuilding his strength. Jacob helped him mend the fences. Margaret made sure he ate proper meals. And the village? They told his story. The tale of the soldier who had been lost and the dog who never gave up on him. One evening, Margaret stood by the gate watching Elias in the meadow. For the first time in 5 years, he was riding again. Coda ran alongside him, barking as Elias guided the horse through the open field, his posture stronger, more certain. Margaret felt tears burn her eyes. He was healing. He was home. As the sun dipped below the hills, Elias rode back toward the fence and dismounted gracefully. He turned to Margaret, a soft, grateful smile on his lips. "Thank you," he said quietly. Margaret shook her head. "Don't thank me." She looked at Coda, who sat proudly beside them. "Thank him." Elias followed her gaze. Coda wagged his tail, and for the first time since returning, Elias let out a deep, genuine laugh. "I already did." Years later, when children in Ridgewood asked about the brave war hero, their parents told them the real story. Not just about Captain Elias Carter, the soldier who was lost and found, but about Coda, the wolfdog who never stopped waiting. Even after time passed, even when Elias and Margaret grew older, the villagers never forgot. And on certain quiet evenings, when the sun painted the hills in golden light, people swore they could still hear a wolfdog's victorious howl echoing through the valley, a reminder that love, loyalty, and hope would always find their way home.